going easy on me. Appreciate that a lot. And thanks everybody for your warm welcome. I'm glad to see the microphone is working well. I know it worked really great for Bishop Curtis. And never mind. Dear brothers and dear friends, as we know from history, in 1529, the British Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy that designated Henry VIII head of the Church in England. The Irish Parliament did not pass an Act of Supremacy until 1536, and many Irish clergy and laity refused to follow their leaders into apostasy. Even so, the British government began to plunder the church, and a new age of martyrs dawned. Among them was St. Oliver Plunkett, who we met this morning. In 1681, after a period of brutal persecution against the Catholic Church in Ireland, Oliver Plunkett stood on the scaffold at Tyburn in London. He had spent many years in prison and had been the victim of perjury. Those who had stepped forward to accuse him of trying to foment rebellion. Eyewitnesses described the Archbishop's strength, serenity, and courage. From the scaffold, he delivered his last homily, worthy of an apostle and a martyr, rebutting the charges made against him and bearing witness to the faith. He publicly forgave those responsible for his death, and he is numbered among the hundreds who at Tyburn gave their lives for their faith. In December 2010, I visited Tyburn, and I knelt at the spot where St. Oliver Plunkett and so many English and Irish martyrs gave their lives to bear witness to their faith. A more aggressive approach to religious persecution, one might say, was taken up by an Irish-born Archbishop of New York. Not Cardinal Dolan, but Archbishop John Hughes, Dagger John, as he's known to history. He's known as Dagger John because we bishops put a cross in front of our name. Mine is just a puny little cross, but his looked like a dagger. You know, the United States was founded on high ideals, including that of religious liberty. But our country does not always live up to its founding principles, as we know. Archbishop Hughes was a strong leader who championed the rights of Irish immigrants, campaigned against religious bigotry, and presided over a tremendous period of growth for the church in New York, including laying the cornerstone of the new St. Patrick's Cathedral in 1858. But Archbishop Hughes was more than a community organizer or a builder. He spoke out against the bigotry of the know-nothings, the nativists, but he didn't just rail against those who opposed the church. Rather, he, together with his priest, evangelized the masses of people coming from Ireland to our shores in the mid-19th centuries. He taught them faith, taught them morals, gave them a work ethic, and provided them with institutions by which they could climb out of prejudice and poverty. Few religious leaders have ever been stronger. Few have left a greater mark than he did. And I would submit to you this morning, gentlemen, that we are still standing on his shoulders. It's important for you and me not only to practice our faith, but to bear witness to it. And there are times when we have to defend our faith and to defend our God-given liberty to practice our faith. This is one of those times. We are the spiritual descendants of Oliver Plunkett and John Hughes. We are the descendants of those families who came from Ireland not only to escape famine, but also who brought with them their Catholic faith, a faith they had to learn how to profess and live in a new country that was very different from their native lands. As their descendants, we have a role to play in the struggle that lays before us now to defend our liberty. It's not against Henry VIII. It's not against the know-nothings. It's against an anti-religious secularism that you and I can absorb just by being a part of our culture. Recently, candidate John F. Kennedy's speech to the Houston Ministerial Association was back in the news, a speech that was controversial then and now. But I'd call your attention to what President John F. Kennedy said in his inaugural. He said, "The rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but rather from the hand of God." Our most fundamental rights, our constitutionally guaranteed rights, are not given to us by the government. Rather, we're endowed with them by the Creator. And among these is religious liberty. How far removed is President Kennedy's vision and that of the Founding Fathers from the full-page ad that appeared last Friday in the New York Times from the Freedom from Religion Foundation, inviting Catholics to abandon their faith? And why? Because church leaders have dared to defend the church's right to deliver educational, healthcare, and social services according to church teaching. Gentlemen, we got work to do. There's a lot of threats to religious liberty in our nation, and as you are aware, there are many violations of religious liberty abroad. It's estimated that 70% of the world's population are either restrained from practicing their faith or suffer persecution for doing so. Just think about the Coptic Christians in Egypt. 200,000 of them have either been killed or driven from their homeland. And what's their crime? They're Christian. For people in terrible straits like that, the United States has always been a beacon of hope. Not just because it's a land of opportunity, and thank God it is, but also because it's a land of freedom. Which is why the Health and Human Services mandate requires our attention. We have to get this right if we want to defend religious liberty elsewhere. This has been widely portrayed as a controversy about contraception. It is not. It is not. Rather, it is a struggle for religious liberty, and let me tell you why. Since 1919, the bishops of the United States have supported universal access to health care. This does not mean that we supported the Patient Affordable Health Care Act in all of its details, and we certainly lobbied hard that the bill would include adequate conscience protection for Catholic hospitals, clinics, nursing homes, schools, and the insurance programs run by Catholic institutions. The bill was passed without adequate conscience protection. In place of that, we're now facing a serious threat in the form of bureaucratic rules issued by unelected officials. The rules from HHS do a couple things. First, those rules mandate that all private insurance programs must cover without copays so-called preventive services, like abortion-inducing drugs, sterilization, contraception. Until now, we have had broad federal protection against having to do things like this. Since 1973, there have been laws on the books, ERISA, the Federal Tax Code, that have accommodated all religious groups in the United States perfectly. These things are now being overturned. Meanwhile, things like high blood pressure medicine, AIDS drugs, hospitalization, that's all been bumped down to the states, where it's going to be covered unevenly across the 50 states. Second, you may have read that HHS gave an exemption to religious institutions. But in giving an exemption, HHS imposed a definition on religious institutions, deciding on its own which ones are religious enough to be exempt. Those that hire their own members, those that serve their own members, and those that exist only to propagate their teachings. In other words, Jesus and the apostles would not have qualified. Well, there was a pretty big uproar, and so the administration has tried to define us again. It's defined some of our institutions, like hospitals and universities, as semi-religious, as secular businesses with a connection to the church. These would have to provide preventive services, but now through their insurers. That doesn't work, because most church institutions, including the Diocese of Bridgeport, are self-insured. In other words, having been redefined, classified, and sorted out by the government, we are now being forced by the government to facilitate and fund things contrary to our teaching. Whether or not one agrees with the church's teaching is really beside the point here. This isn't the role of government. And if government can breach the wall and force any religious body to violate its teaching about any subject today, it can do almost anything it wants to do tomorrow. Here's the problem. The government has no business defining us. The minute the government tells us who we are and starts classifying and sorting out our institutions, and then tells us to violate our teachings, religious liberty in this country, for all practical purposes, is dead. Instead, it is for us to tell the government who we are, how we are organized, and what we stand for, even if it's unpopular. And unless there is some compelling interest, like national security, the government should continue, as it has in the past, to accommodate our institutions. Because, gentlemen, our institutions make a huge, huge contribution to the common good. We should be very proud to be Catholics. So just as Ireland had to stand up for the right to self-determination, so too, I come before you this morning to say that we Catholics and all of our religious compatriots must stand up for our right for self-determination. But you might ask me, Bishop, how did it get this bad? What would make the government think it can do this? Well, I'm no political analyst. I'm just a country bishop from Connecticut.
Democrat.
I'm an independent. But I would dare say that some decided that the Catholic Church in the United States is too weak, and too disorganized, and too divided to resist what might otherwise be a politically advantageous move. I think this involved a little measure of miscalculation because the pushback has been pretty strong. But you know, I bear the blame. I think we all bear the blame for the perception that our church is so weak that its freedom and its mission can be set aside. We do have to imitate the example of Oliver Plunkett and John Hughes, who knew that to defend our religious liberty, if we're going to do this, we have to be strong. Strong in our adherence to the faith. We have to love it, embrace it, put it into practice, even when and maybe perhaps because its teachings are not culturally popular. Archbishop Hughes could never have done what he did in New York unless he, as priests, and many of the lay Catholic faithful took pride in their faith. Yes, we've been through tough times in our church, but the time has come for us all to stand up and be counted. And let's not wait till everything is perfect in our church. It will not be perfect until about a half an hour, until the Lord comes back in glory. So we have to let our voices be heard now. One parish in this diocese sent 2,300 cards to our congressional delegation. And about a month ago, a Connecticut congressman told me that he had received 4,000 letters from just a handful of parishes. One website alone has sent 500,000 communications to Congress, and there have been many, many more calls, cards, emails, and letters besides. But as you can see, we still have to keep speaking. I'm not sure they're listening. And just as Archbishop Hughes fought for the rights of the church, so too, with generous assistance from major law firms, segments of the church, like universities and charitable organizations and some hospitals, have either begun or are in the process of entering into litigation to fight against this wrong. What can we do? Number one, pray. What did Christ say to us? Without me, you can do nothing. This is not just a political movement. This is loving our faith. And so prayer has got to be at the heart of it. Prayer so that our country will always be a beacon of freedom. We're starting a prayer campaign, and that's going to be announced shortly. I hope you'll be part of it. Second, there's no substitute for practicing our faith, for knowing our faith and being able to defend it. The stronger we are as Catholics, the better able we will be to meet this challenge. Third, we have to be defenders of our faith in our daily life. Where does the battle get joined? Sometimes it's the dinner table, sometimes it's a dinner party, sometimes it's among your golfing buddies, sometimes your colleagues at work, and sometimes among those who don't really realize that religious liberty is in the crosshairs. Even those who are not religious, who practice no faith at all, have a stake in this. If religious liberty is fatally compromised, it will not be too long before freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and freedom of assembly are compromised. Fourth, please make your voices heard before your publicly elected officials. Keep the cards, letters, emails coming, and remind them that you're voters. Let's tell them that religious liberty is far too precious to be protected by bureaucratic rules that can be changed by unelected officials at the stroke of a pen. Our ancestors came to this great country searching not just for prosperity, but for freedom. All of our founding fathers and our Catholic faith itself teach us how fundamental religious liberty is to human freedom and to human dignity. Let us not allow this precious God-given gift to slip through our fingers. Let us not squander the inheritance we receive from God through our forebears who left Aaron's shores for these shores. Thanks for listening. May God bless us and may God bless the United States of America.